you have an Instagram video that does a great job talking through the difference between appropriation and appreciation.
Mm.
Could you explain a little bit about that? And could you talk about how you were maybe able to observe that as you started to see some of the ripple effects of you maybe leading this movement?
Well, do you know what? In terms of cultural appropriation and appreciation, people don't know this, but really, where my obsession with this question stems from my own, I'm going to say, confusion, right? Because when I started Ghana Kitchen, I was very cognizant of the fact that I didn't want to be perceived as appropriating the culture from which I'm from. Like,
Uh-huh.
that was really, really important to me. Like, I didn't want Ghanaians to think I was bastardizing it. I also didn't want people to think that I was representing Ghanaian food on,
Sure.
uh, carte blanche kind of thing. It was,
Uh-huh.
and that is specifically why I called it Zoe's Ghana Kitchen
Sure.
to really pull it to me. It's like, this is my relationship.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
this is my story as regards the food.
Versus like the Ghana Kitchen, like capital T, the
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Mm. And um, and what happened is, over time, and don't, it's also important to know that I had nothing to do with a food scene, right? I didn't come from
Mhm. Mhm.
hospitality. I'd never
Mhm.
worked in a restaurant. I wasn't culinary trained. So that world was outside of me, and I was very much in
Mhm.
my bubble, making food I love to make, playing with flavors and ingredients for the passion and for the play and for the love, right? So I was very much outside of an industry that likes to label and other and do all of these things. But I was
Uh-huh.
cognizant that it was there in terms of how I spoke about my own stuff.
Uh-huh.
And the more, like, especially once the cookbook came out in 2017 and leading up to that, and the more I was integrated into that food scene culture, the more horrified I became by the cultural appropriation consistently smothering me. Like, I couldn't
Uh,
believe how many people thought it was okay to start a Thai street food stall when they had nothing to
uh-huh.
do with the culture, or a Vietnamese, or, all of these cultures were being appropriated by middle class rich white men.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the time without any authenticity behind what they were doing. So they were
Uh-huh.
doing a very bad translation of the cuisine, but making a lot of money doing it.
Right.
And it just became increasingly more alarming to me that that was the thing that was happening.
Uh-huh.
So to bring it back to that video, in recent years, so my focus shifted from, pioneering West African food and flavors for, let's say, the first 8, 9 years of what I was doing, to now the last 3 or 4 years, my focus has been on this idea of decolonizing the food industry and making people understand what cultural appropriation is and does, and the negative effect it
Uh-huh.
has on the culture, um, both from a wealth building perspective and from an equitable perspective in terms of who gets congratulated for what and what that reward
Uh-huh.
means. Um, and, just in looking at the whole food chain and the whole food system and who benefits out of this, and usually it's not black or brown people, and it's because of cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
And so the difference is, and I should also point out, I have an anecdote here which highlights, like, my involvement in appropriation,
Mm.
if you like, for want of some better
Mhm.
words.
Mhm.
Whereas I was taking a taxi one time, and the driver was a Ghanaian man, and we were having a chat,
Mm.
as you want to do with your taxi driver. Even if
Mhm.
you don't want to, you have to. And, I was telling him he asked me what I did for a living. I said, I'm a cook, I'm a chef. And then he heard I was Ghanaian, and then he realized I was the Zoe from Zoe's Ghana Kitchen, which he had
Huh.
heard of, and he pulled over.
Yeah.
He was like,
Huh.
he couldn't believe it that I was in his car.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
thought, oh,
Yeah.
he's a fan. This is nice. Anyway,
Yeah.
he pulled over the car, and he showed me a WhatsApp message group that he was on before I got into his car.
Yeah.
And it's basically this big discussion between a load of Ghanaians in Ghana about me and about Zoe's
Huh.
Ghana Kitchen and about the cookbook, and basically questioning whether I had the right to, whether it was good or bad, what I was doing for the cuisine. Like there was a
Huh.
whole thing about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then I had to have a big conversation with him about, what my purpose was and what I'm doing. And, I'm trying to
Yeah.
bring the culture some love and light, not rip it off kind of thing.
Yeah.
So just so that people know that, I guess what my point is that it is possible to be considered within your culture as appropriating your culture, which is exactly what I was scared of at the beginning, right?
Sure. Yeah. Right. Right.
I'm just putting my hands up to say that I'm not without being a target for that
Hmm.
accusation.
Yeah. What was that like for you? Did that experience? It feels like that would be the kind of thing where when you stepped into the taxi versus when you stepped out of the taxi,
I mean,
where your mind is like a completely separate place.
yeah. I mean, it was interesting. It was funny, mostly, to be honest.
Hmm.
But I convinced him of my argument.
Yeah.
To be honest, he was already on my side. I think there was
Sure.
other
Sure.
people in the group who were a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But so there's purists in any culture. You'll have purists who will say that this isn't Ghanaian food, or this is X, this is Y. It's a very
Sure.
complex field to negotiate, but there are some basic rules that I think should stand as regards identifying appropriation versus appreciation. And when you are appreciating a culture, you're not claiming it as your own if it's not your own, right? So you're signposting where you've got these recipes from. You're
Hmm.
signposting what the mother recipe is if you're changing it. You're honoring the people that created it or produced it, who gave you the knowledge to be able to pass it on. It's really about respect for where the food comes from or the recipe comes from in the
Hmm.
first place. And then it's about, if you want to monetize that, it's about ensuring that at some point in the monetization process, there's somebody involved in the culture who gets to benefit from it equally, because it's not
Hmm.
okay. Otherwise, it's tantamount to like colonialism and just going into
Hmm.
somewhere and taking everything that's good, which still goes on in Africa, honestly. There's a
Hmm.
huge Chinese influence there right now, where there's a lot of
Hmm.
colonization going on, frankly. But, um, you know, appropriation is, I went to, I'm sorry to use Thailand consistently as an example, it's just a really good example.
Yeah.
People go to the Far East, they go to Southeast Asia, they have a 2 week holiday, they taste some delicious lapsang, or they taste, whatever it is, and they're like, oh,
Uh-huh.
that's amazing. I can make this, and I'm gonna
Yeah.
start a food business, right? And they'll come back, and that's what they'll do. But they won't necessarily learn how to make it from the right person. They won't hire
Uh-huh.
any people from the culture in relation to producing that. They won't reference anything about the culture properly, and more often than not, they will bastardize the recipes to make them palatable to,
Uh,
where they're serving it. And the same thing happens with cookbooks a lot. It's like people go on holiday for 2 weeks when they've got nothing to do with the culture and come back and write a cookbook about the
uh-huh.
culture. It's like,
Uh-huh.
if black and brown people don't have that privilege, so if we don't have that privilege, can you leave our culture alone and let us be the ones to talk about it and write about it and sell the
Uh-huh.
food and monetize it, kind of thing? Anyway,
Yeah.
I bang on about cultural appropriation a lot. If
Mhm.
you Google me and cultural appropriation, there's plenty out there. And,
Well, it's good, and is one of the reasons why, Alexa on our team reached out and shared that video with me. She said, "I think this would be a really good conversation because it's really applicable, obviously, to the food world, other worlds as well."
yeah,
Um, had a conversation. I don't remember what episode this was, but if people follow along with the podcast, with Marcus Samuelson, fellow New Yorker, and he drew analogies to music, like in that world, and how music as an art form, much like food as an art form, um, it's there's a lot of analogies that can exist within there, and folks can check out that podcast episode as well, to hear his thoughts on it.
and the same
um,
fashion. Like in 2010,
yeah, 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 yep, another example.
I
Yeah.
remember saying in 2010 that they've already started appropriating the music. This is when like Afro beats and high life started coming into mainstream pop in Europe, in
Uh-huh.
a significant way. And also in fashion, you would see a lot of traditional, and I can't name all the different types of fabrics, so I'm going to use the shorthand of African fabric
Sure.
because each tribe has their own.
Sure.
In Ghana, we have kente is like the big tribal fabric, but you would see a lot of those patterns coming into commercial big stores like your Primarks and your Henneys and your, big stores. And so I made a point of saying at the time, and that's what happens with food. It's usually the music, the fashion, and then the food that cross over kind of in that
Uh-huh.
order. But
Music first, then
music,
fashion, then food. Yeah.
yeah, and then
Uh-huh.
but usually when it's the original people making it, so young African musicians or young African designers, they don't get to benefit from the mass
Uh-huh.
appropriation of it because it's stolen. It's the
Uh-huh.
beats are stolen. There's no credit given. The
Uh-huh.
idea of the print is stolen, and there's no credit
Yeah.
given. And at the
And
same,
they're not gonna be able to call their attorney and
exactly,
say, yeah.
exactly. And the same thing happened with the food. Just recently, Tom Kerridge just put out a recipe for suya kebabs, and it's like, why? Why is Tom Kerridge
Uh,
putting out a recipe for suya kebabs?
uh,
That's way out of his field of interest or influence.
yeah.
He shouldn't have any hands on that whatsoever. And if the program that allowed him to do that wants to profile West African food, they should pick a West African chef to do it. I
Uh-huh.
mean, I feel very strongly about that. He's got no
Uh-huh.
business putting out that kind of recipe because he didn't even credit where he got it from.
Sure.
Like he didn't invent it, did he? He didn't make it.
Right, right.
It's like,
Yeah.
where did you get that?
Right, right. Do you have examples of, whether it's individuals or companies that you've run into and you're like, "Yes, like, doing this well." Does that exist or not really?
Um, I mean, it's very rare, honestly.
Uh-huh.
Like there's a brand in the States called um, True Moringa, and they have like a, they're a married couple, so it's a bit different. So it's led by a
Okay.
white woman and her partner, who is an African man, I believe, based in Kenya. I think he's Kenyan,
Okay.
so it is slightly different. But I think they do a good job of making sure that this white woman isn't the face of the brand, for example,
Uh-huh.
and that they're telling the story of all the people who work to make those products, and they are amazing products. And highlighting,
What kind of products?
um, so it's basically different extrapolations of moringa. So moringa is a superfood. It's usually
Sure.
consumed as like a very high antioxidant,
Uh,
vitamin-packed ingredient
uh-huh.
for lots of health benefits. Usually consumed in powder form, then maybe you drink it as a tea or something like that. But you can get from moringa, you can get oils, and you can use the fibers. That it's one of those plants like okra or hibiscus where the whole plant
Uh,
has many, many uses. And so
sure.
they have products like moringa-based skincare range, moringa oil, moringa body scrubs, things like that.
Uh-huh.
But I'm not sure it really falls sensibly into this category. The question is, like, is anyone doing it well? I think nobody can do cultural appropriation well.
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
that's the thing. The way that you can, if your company is culturally appropriating, the way that you can change the sting of that is to, as I say, bring in talent, um, whether it's consulting or marketing, or it's like, who are you using to translate the story behind the brand or ingredient
Mhm.
or whatever? How are you doing it? Who are you doing it to? It's very much like
Mhm.
about the lens and the gaze. What we have to get
Yeah.
away from is this kind of white gaze that tells a very restrictive, usually, story, and more often than not, others, the community which it's financially benefiting from. So it's
Uh-huh.
more about that. It's like, who's on your, if you are a white finance company,
Mm.
there's nothing wrong with white people's money, obviously. They have more of it than us usually.
Huh.
But
Sure.
then who's fronting the brand? Who is telling the story of the brand? Who's making the leadership decisions? Who's hiring? Who are you hiring? Um,
Yeah.
and how are you creating a truly diverse and equitable system where
Mhm.
somebody from the culture benefits? You know,
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's kind of getting at the question, maybe for people who are listening to the podcast and they think, um, understanding the category of like, this is something that you shouldn't do. To your point, like can't do cultural appropriation well. Like it's just like that doesn't exist. Proactively, then, what does it look like to do things? And for people who are asking that question, who are listening, um, you spoke to that a little bit, like to think strategically about kind of what it looks like to fold in uh, uh, strong representation of different people. So it's not like, if you have a finance company that it's not all 30 something white guys, it's like if I reached out to my Twin Cities, Minnesota network of friends, like that's probably what it would look like. So how do I think strategically and be proactive if that's something that I want to do of looking considering that and making that a priority. Do you have other thoughts for people who are in the category of, hey, I'm listening to this. I want to uh, not only not do wrong, but I want to do right and to do good. uh what does that look like? Does that question make sense? Or
kind of.
uh
I mean,
I mean, at a basic example would be like supporting businesses who are uh um the creator and the owner is aligned with and connected to like the food that they're creating, like versus some random Thai place in that it doesn't have that connection, like a Thai family, as an example, use the Thai. Hey, go to that Thai restaurant from a Thai family who just immigrated.
exactly.
Other ideas of for people who are like, I'm passionate about this, I want to join in this movement. How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, the consumer has some purchasing power, right? So if enough people start interrogating who they're buying from and is it appropriate
Uh-huh.
to buy this from there. So I know that's quite a lot to put on a consumer. I mean, you think about people like Trader Joe's, right? You go into Trader Joe's and Trader
Right.
Joe's make good stuff, right? They
Hmm.
make good food with ingredients from all over the world, right? Does anybody at Trader Joe's necessarily have anything to do with that? Probably not, but they put out plantain chips, they'll put out various
Uh-huh.
things from all over the world. So
Yeah,
the
yeah.
question is, if you really want to eat plantain chips, maybe you should look up Sunmo Foods, or maybe you should look up another brand like a Sankofa Snacks, right?
Uh-huh.
Who from the culture makes this product? Because it's probably going to be better, honestly. And also,
Yeah.
that then, um, you know, you're supporting the culture from where the food comes from. And
Yep.
there's not just one person making plantain chips, there's hundreds these days. And many
Uh-huh.
of them are black owned businesses. So I think that's the thing is like if you, whether it's, South Asian food or Indian food or any food from the African continent, it's like just look at the label, like where is it made, who who's making it, and are they from the culture or are they ripping the culture off? Because in my
Yeah, yeah.
opinion, if they're not from the culture, then they're ripping the culture off, really.
Uh-huh.
Um,
It's interesting. We did a team event with a chocolate maker in Jamaica, and he was talking about the four, really like the four chocolate companies and the disconnect that exists between where the cocoa is harvested and when it's like actually then sold and like Target, and it's like, wow, you can start to understand that as why it's important, the significance of um, buying, like trying to understand where you're buying from and getting as close to the source as possible. Would that be an accurate way to describe
That
it?
would be a really great way to describe it. And cocoa is a great example because, for example, Ghana makes, I don't know, something like 80 or 90% of the cocoa products in Europe are used Ghanaian cocoa.
Mhm.
Um, However, because it's not, the facilities aren't yet in Ghana to process that chocolate, right? Because the money isn't there within the indigenous community to, and maybe the knowledge as well yet, but it is happening soon, I hope,
Mhm.
process that cocoa into consumer bars. So, they ship out the cocoa. It goes to Belgium, it goes to France, it goes everywhere, it goes to America as well, to be honest. And then it's sold back to Ghana in bars that people can't
Mm,
afford.
mhm.
Nobody can
Mhm,
afford to buy
mhm.
those bars of chocolate, and it's their
Mhm.
cocoa, which is
Yeah, yeah.
just insane, you know?
Uh,
And like that's
uh-huh.
part of the problem. It's like, and again, this isn't, I'm not trying to say that consumers, you're bad people for not knowing this stuff and you're not bad people for making better choices, but there is an opportunity now and there is some responsibility to educate yourself because it's also
Mhm.
about sustainability. It all contributes at the intersection of sustainability and what is, how do we all survive and thrive in this world, right?
Mhm.
um, with as much equity and equality built into it as possible. And it's not any
Mhm.
longer okay for big white conglomerates to be the only people benefiting from tech, finance,
Mhm.
and mass marketing consumerism, especially when they're
Mm.
doing it in a way that, um, as I said before, others or diminishes the communities and cultures from which they're making that capital
Mm.
benefit.
Mhm. Mhm.
Capitalism doesn't have to be a bad, dirty thing, but it
Mhm.
certainly needs to be done better. And also, there's lots and lots of brands now. Look at Diaspora Co. Um, I think most brands these days will wear their mission on their sleeve.
Mhm.
If they, and look at Burlap and Barrel in New York, and which is a white-owned company, but it's selling spices from around the world. But in fact, there's your example, because you asked for one, Burlap and Barrel.
Mm.
Because what they
Sure.
do,
As a company who you'd say, "Hey, look at this," as an
they,
example.
they
Maybe not everything right, but a lot of things right.
well, they're very sensitive about telling the story of the people and the places where the ingredients come from. And it's not
Mm.
like, hi, I'm a white guy and I found the best X ingredient, this
Mhm.
chili in the world. Like, no, you didn't.
Mm.
You
Mhm.
hired somebody to help you. Yeah, and they're honest about that. And I
Mhm.
think you as a consumer, if you go to a website and they're telling you that, if they're telling you we work in partnership with this farm and we do this to ensure these fair wages, and we have a very short, transparent supply chain, and if you
Mhm.
see words like that on a website, um, that should encourage you to want to purchase from that company because
Mhm.
there is a value chain there. Like um, there's responsibility being taken along the supply chain for making sure that people are getting paid properly and also that people are getting recognition for what they
Mm.
contribute to that ingredient being on the shelf at the end of the day.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
that's what's missing, notably missing from a lot of the large companies is, the same companies that would put up black squares during Black Lives Matter,
Mhm.
a year later, what have they done to change their policies around anything, um,
Mhm.
as regards diversity and equity, inclusion, stuff like that? Not very much, honestly. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of virtue signaling that goes on, and I think that's the hard piece for consumers to navigate. But um, there is a small responsibility on us as people who purchase things to be mindful of that. And it's complicated with restaurants in particular because
Sure.
there also comes a point like who owns this cuisine anymore, and like what, because so much, especially in America, so much cuisine
Yeah.
is beyond fusion, right? Because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
especially when you think of the East Coast, like in New York, there's so many restaurants where you can eat ingredients from all over the world on one menu, right?
Uh-huh.
And I recently just I want to write an article about this particular thing actually, so you're getting a sneak peek into this. But
All right, good preview.
I went to a restaurant in Asheville recently. The name of which sounds Japanese but is actually Native American.
Huh.
And the strap line for the restaurant says Japanese smokehouse, but it's not a smokehouse,
Sure.
right? And the menu, which was incredible, I have to say,
Uh-huh.
first and foremost, everything on the menu was stunning. Like, the taste, the flavor, the presentation, the execution was brilliant. But it wasn't, there was Japanese ingredients involved in
Uh-huh.
most of the dishes, but it wasn't Japanese food and it wasn't Japanese street food, which is the other thing they're calling it, influenced
Mm.
by Japanese street. So, and then I found out that there's no Japanese person working in the kitchen. However,
Sure.
the chefs that have been hired to deliver that menu have experience of working in Asia at length,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um, for some time. So it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
what do we?
There's not it's not black and white clear
Yeah, it's not
line.
always
Yeah, yeah.
black and white. But what I can say is, like, while the food was absolutely stunning, and I would recommend anyone to go there, I
Uh-huh.
do take issue with the name. I do take issue with how they're describing the menu, and I do take
Sure.
issue with the fact that it is cultural appropriation.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
and even that a point was made that the owner had never. The owner has a bit of an empire around the concept of
Mhm.
Japanese food, right? Not just this one place.
Mhm.
And there was almost like this braggadocious element to him being like, "I've never been to Japan."
Mm.
And it's
Mhm.
like, okay.
Mhm.
I just
Mhm.
wonder, like, what the thinking is behind that. It's like, why wouldn't you hire a Japanese chef if you're so focused on that? Like, what is it that stops you from enabling the community to participate in it?
Mhm.
It's very
Yeah.
curious to me.
And to your point, it seems like that um more than n- uh, important beyond anything is to understand and consider and to know that there will never probably be an instance where you'll be able to say, "Hey, this checks every single box,"
Right,
and maybe there might be some instances of that, but it sounds like there's a spectrum, and what you realize is that spectrum can shift from either extreme, and to be aware of it for people who aren't, and I think it's a huge part of this conversation is introducing that awareness level for people who maybe weren't aware at all or were aware but not really, and maybe hopefully leveling that up a little bit.